The Russian Duma welcomed me in an extremely friendly way. It was Leonid Slutsky who headed the Russian delegation, and Mr. Slutsky and I, we have then established a kind of dialogue, an ongoing dialogue between the Duma and the European Parliament, an informal one, because of course there is no official support for this, but at least we meet by video conferences, and we are going to meet in person next week in Istanbul, because we cannot do it in the European Union because of the sanctions policy. But the dialogue exists, and I hope, of course, that we can officialize it at some point when we abandon the sanctions policy. Now, about the subjects that we are raising today, I would like to offer a few comments from the perspective maybe of a very small country. We have talked a lot about hegemony and the role of large states, but most countries in Europe are small countries such as mine, and therefore I have perhaps a different point of view on a number of issues. We hear, of course, that the United States have very important strategic concepts, and when we listen to Venezuela, to Iran, and other things, we are of course reminded of these strategic concepts developed by the RAND Corporation, that Russia has to be dismembered in order to weaken it. We have heard Lloyd Austin, the Minister of Defense of President Biden, that Russia has to be weakened. We hear Mr. Rubio saying that Ukraine is a proxy war between the United States and Russia, and so on. But at least the Americans have strategic concepts. They lead a war, or they have their policy line, but at least they try to follow a strategy. And the first question that I always have when I look at European policies, do we have a strategy at all? What kind of strategic reflection do we have as a European Union, or are we just following what the Americans are telling us, or maybe some of the larger member states in the European Union are telling the smaller ones to do, but without a real concept about it? What is the European strategy in itself? What purpose does it serve? Because we should all agree in Western Europe that the dismemberment, the weakening, the chaos in Russia would actually not serve at all our own interest. Russia is a nuclear power, it is of essential importance for the stability in the world, so aren't we following a policy that is directed against our own interests? I would like to offer you maybe a small trip over the last year. So just to recapitulate what we have been living through in Western Europe, and of course in relation with Russia, and just to ask ourselves the questions, what actually happened? Why have we been doing this? And I would like to start with the Minsk agreements. In those days, when we had the Minsk agreements, actually Germany and France were guarantors, as Russia was. Russia was not a direct party to the Minsk agreement, but it was also a guarantor state, and it was the duty of these states to ensure that the Ukrainian authorities would federalize Ukraine and look also after the interest of the autonomists in Lugansk and Donetsk, and they have not been doing that. So we have been learning later on that Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Hollande, they said it publicly, that they actually did not want to implement the Minsk agreements. And my perspective from a small member state of the European Union is, of course, have we been informed, have we been asked, why are these two states creating a situation of conflict which are affecting actually every member state of the European Union, including the small and medium ones? What was the interest, what was their legitimacy to do this? On behalf of what? They created a kind of what we call in foreign policy a directoire. You know, they decide what all the others have to do. And as from a smaller member state, I say, no, this is not the way that we should do it. We have to take into account the interest of everybody. So if we remember the history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this was considered, after the First World War, you know, this was considered to be like a kind of the prison of European peoples. And it has led to the dismemberment of this empire. And I often ask myself the question, well, common foreign and security policy, if not the interest of all member states are duly taken into account, are we going to assist in Europe to a dismemberment, maybe not of the European Union as such, but at least of parts of the policy that we are following? Let's continue our trip in history, and we have now talked about the Minsk agreements and the decision not to implement those agreements. with no mandate at all, probably from everybody. But then we come to the situation in April 22. You know that in February 22 we had the invasion, and we had then a month of negotiations in Gomel and then in Istanbul. And then finally in Istanbul the Ukrainians and the Russians initialed a treaty which was quite favorable to Ukraine and based on a proposal by Ukraine. And then Deus ex machina, we see Boris Johnson coming to Kiev and saying, don't sign, but continue fighting, we are going to support you. And again the question is, who told him to do so? Who gave him a mandate and the legitimacy and the authority to do that? On which behalf? For which strategic interest? By whom? Why should we stop the signing of a peace treaty, or at least a treaty that would lead to peace between Russia and Ukraine? For what? And on behalf of whom? So again, we have the question that we had already on the Minsk agreements: who was really deciding about European politics and why? I don't know the answer, and I think that probably not many people know the answer, but it is important, because if we have to talk about European policy and honesty and our relations and how to build them, well, we have to be honest also and know who is deciding what. Certainly not the small and medium member states, but our people are affected as your people are affected. So we had this situation and we can ask ourselves, when the Western narrative that this war is an unprovoked and unjustified invasion by Russia, well, that stops in April 22, because then a treaty was initialed and Boris Johnson came and prolonged the war. So even if we believe the propaganda that it was an unprovoked and unjustified war, we have to change the narrative from April 22, because it was a completely change of situation. And we can continue like this. Now again, 4 years later, after 4 years of an unnecessary and brutal war with hundreds of thousands of casualties, now we have the situation that the European Union is standing there with, again, no concept except militarization. We are turning now the European Union into a military alliance, a European pillar of NATO, and again, we do it without consulting national parliaments, without referenda in member states, without respecting the neutrality of Austria, of Ireland, and maybe also of others who would be interested. So we are again assisting to something that is decided somewhere far above our heads and implemented in a non-democratic way. You can understand that this is a deep worry for people such as Thomas Geisel and myself, who are in European Parliament, who are committed to peace and who would like to have good relations with Russia, and probably many other people also asking ourselves what actually is happening to us. Why are we not pursuing a policy of détente and look forward to preventing an arms race with Russia, to come back to a policy of responsibility and of moral attitude? Why are we doing something which is contrary to our interests? Why are we not observing democracy? We are deeply worried about the European Union in the West, and I would like also, Thomas Geisel has mentioned